Rural economies impact urban economies. We just don't always see it day to day.
Most farmers in America are running their businesses on razor-thin margins. And out of every dollar you spend on food, they see about 5 cents.
Now the margin structure is too squeezed and volatility is too high. You're at the knife's edge too often.
Those numbers are starting to show up in a real way. According to public filings, more than 300 farms filed for bankruptcy in 2025. That's a 46% increase from the year before. But here's the part that almost nobody realizes. A huge number of farms are still managing their finances on pen and paper. In this episode, I sit down with Mackenzie Burnett. She's Ambrook's co-founder and CEO, and we discuss how she's building an AI-driven financial toolkit that is designed specifically for American farms and farmers. I'm Allie Garfinkle, and this is Termsheet. Now, before we get to our interview with Mackenzie, on to this week's news. Now, this week's news is last week's news, is next week's news, the SpaceX IPO. Last week, we got the news that SpaceX has confidentially filed to go public. Now, we've been hearing for a while that this is going to happen, but seeing the reports come down marks another step in what is going to be the biggest IPO in history by all counts. This is an IPO that is approaching $2 trillion in projected valuation. Now, if you're sitting there trying to think, okay, is that a big deal? The answer is it is a massive deal. On one hand, it is going to test retail investors' appetite, not only for Elon Musk's companies, but for AI and where a lot of folks in tech see the future going, but it's also going to be a test for the private markets. One of the fundamental mechanics in the private markets over the last few years has been something called secondary sales. Now, if you're uninitiated, secondary shares are much like shares in any other company. For instance, if you're out there buying stock of Disney, you can, in theory, actually also buy stock in Anthropic or OpenAI or SpaceX. And that has been the case for the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Secondaries have increasingly become a way that people are able to get into companies that are still private. Now, here is the problem. A lot of folks have been buying secondaries in SpaceX for a very long time. There are a lot of people caught up in this. A lot of people are going to be caught up in the SpaceX IPO. A lot of people who would be caught up in an IPO for Anthropic or OpenAI. The other thing, too, that you need to remember here is the line between the public and private markets has been blurring for a long time. But we forget that a lot of the tools by which that is happening are not very well regulated, and a lot of them are not stress tested. And the thing about a SpaceX IPO, on one hand, is going to be, I'm sure, very celebratory for a lot of people, but is also going to be, in a lot of ways, the first big test for how the private markets have evolved. If you have feelings about this like I do, please leave a comment, shoot me an email. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. If there is something you want to know or you want me to look into, please let me know. This is something I am going to be spending a lot of time on in the lead up to both the SpaceX and OpenAI prospective IPOs. And now we're going to switch gears to one of my other very different favorite topics, farms. Here's my interview with Mackenzie. Hi, this is actually our first time meeting in person.
Meeting face to face.
Meeting face. Yeah. How does it feel?
It feels great. You look great.
Thank you.
Monochrome. It's incredible.
We'll do full monochrome next time. I am so excited to talk to you because this is a topic that our audience probably has not thought about for more than 5 seconds in their life. We are here because you are one of my favorite people to talk to about the state of farming in America. So last year, over 300 farms filed for bankruptcy, and that's an almost 50% increase from the year before. You've talked before about the system being antiquated and failing farmers. What is the antiquated system and why is it failing?
Antiquated system is maybe folks are on desktop software that they bought 20 years ago, or they're really relying on paper ledgers, spreadsheets, or bringing a box of receipts to their account at the end of the year. It's not because they're bad at doing the business. It is that it is a complicated business to run. And usually those activities are done by full-time financial professionals on, let's say, at a startup company. And so it's usually these husband and wife couples, if not, there's other structures obviously as well. But these are family-run businesses that are spending most of their time working on running the business, not on the financials of the business. The reason why that system is failing is because where you could have had the margin structure to kind of get by with really only, doing a good job at being a craftsman or a farm. Now the margin structure is too squeezed and volatility is too high. You're at the knife's edge too often.
In the most simplistic terms, imagine the least technical person you know. What does Ambrook do?
So Ambrook, we build financial tools, so software, for farms, ranches, and increasingly other types of businesses in what we call the real economy. You can think of processing or anything along the supply chain. So processing, general contracting, trucking, real estate. But we started with farms, and most of our customers are farms today. And by financial tools, what we mean are accounting software, banking, invoicing, bill pay, inventory management, that kind of stuff.
Now, tell me a little bit about the origin story, because I hear hundreds of startup pitches a week. When this came through into my inbox, I was like, I haven't heard this one before. So what is the Ambrook origin story?
Yeah, so the mission of Ambrook it has always been, and we've always sort of been orienting around how do we help build a more prosperous and resilient America. And when you dig into that question, enough, you hit a farm. Just the backbone of a lot of the resources that get produced in the U.S., not just actually food, but a lot of byproducts as well. Any of these natural resource industries are really at the heart of the U.S. economy, and they're very both naturally and nationally strategic, which is why you have a lot of infrastructure that is built around supporting agriculture in any country. So that was the core mission of the company. There's a long history that I have with agriculture and love for that in particular, but really started the company about 6 years ago with two of my friends from college. This is a very lofty mission. Like, what does it actually look like to do this in a very kind of more grassroots American dynamism way, I would say, than something more top down, and really wanted to have the opportunity to work with millions of small businesses across America to do so.
But why do farmers need their own financial software in the first place?
A farm is unique only in the sense that it's kind of overly complicated for the size of business it is, or the type of staff it has to actually run the finance side of the business. And so farms are really, I think you can basically map an accounting system on a 2x2 of is it a single P&L or a multi P&L business? So does one business line or a bunch of different business lines or locations or something? And then the other axis is it balance sheet light or balance sheet heavy? Balance sheet heavy basically means, does it deal with the real world in some way, right? Like physical assets and liabilities and different entity structures.
This isn't enterprise SaaS. We have things that go bad here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I think that's exactly. And so farms are all the way on this category that a lot of the existing software out there was built for much simpler types of businesses, but they don't have the team or resources to onboard to the $100,000 version of that. And I think we ended up realizing that actually what a lot of these businesses were missing, going back to the mission of the company, which is how do you build a more prosperous and resilient America? If you think of it from the grassroots, they're missing a sense of real-time visibility into where they're making and losing money. They're not able to just inspect their business and ask a simple feeling question, which is how much should I price, this milk for or something. That's actually a really complicated enterprise and managerial accounting question. They all should probably have CFOs, right, to answer, but they don't. The beauty of software is that you can pick at those types of problems and questions, and you can make things easier. There's a lot of things now that have made that a lot easier to be able to build software to answer those types of questions without requiring someone to be full-time in the books all the time.
Tell me a little bit about some of the use cases. You mentioned pricing milk. What are some other things like that, so someone sitting listening to this can imagine how this actually works for a farmer or a rancher?
So a good example is we have one of our customers is multi-enterprise, so it's the multi P&L aspect. So they don't just grow crops, but they also have a rental business with Airbnb, and they do wedding venues. So imagine that's sort of a common farm nowadays, is trying to spin out more and more ways to get different types of income. They had budgeted $35,000 for the rental side of the business. And they thought that they were on track for that. But with Ambrook, and they've only been on the platform for a couple of months, and they actually realized that they were overspending already on that by, about $15,000. And now for some people, maybe in who are you normally listen to your podcast, maybe $15,000 is not that much, money in the P&L of a much larger business. But for a business that's doing, $200K a year, it's a huge portion of their margin. And so really being able to get someone a real-time sense of where they're making and losing money so they can make decisions in real time to course correct. Our customers are the average farm or a lot of these small businesses across America, but it does maybe, it swings year to year, but maybe 5% margins if you're lucky. And so it's not a lot of wiggle room, to make mistakes.
So the independent farms that are producing a huge portion of our food, a substantial portion of our food, our business is running on 5% margin.
Yeah, some data that just came out that the farmers see about 5 cents of every food dollar in America.
5 cents?
5 cents.
5 cents. Tell me a little bit about the role technology plays in agriculture, because on one hand, if you look at history, some of the earliest technological innovations are plows. They're related to farming, right? At the same time, I think there is a perception that farming has lagged behind in technological innovation. What do you make of that?
So I actually
you put it down. You're like, okay, we're in it now.
So every farmer in America has a smartphone. It's not like it's like they're finding out about Ambrook on Facebook, right? I've noticed actually it's a common question I hear sometimes from investors or even candidates, which is like, oh, are farmers digitally native? And it's like, no, they're just as digitally native as anyone who uses consumer technology. It's just that startups kind of have, we kind of live in a bubble where a lot of software is built for us. And so we benefit from a lot of really great modern UI. And so a lot of what software farms are using lags behind the hardware that they're using. They're all on the latest, like John Deere, or even sometimes they're choosing to opt for older units that are easier to repair, but they're making a choice basically actively. They haven't historically had as much of a choice on the software side. That is a big reason why I think Ambrook exists to help fix that. But I think it's from a relationship to technology perspective, sometimes it has been easier for them to do things on paper ledgers because the business itself is in a ironic way at a level of complication that the existing software out there didn't really help with. And so it was rather than figure that out, it was easier to kind of remain on spreadsheets or paper ledger. I mean, 50% of our customers are coming off of pen and paper. There are millions of businesses in the US that still run on effectively paper ledgers and spreadsheets and not any accounting software at all. We are, for half of our customers, their first business software really that they're using in a real way. And so they had a choice before, but it's just like they're choosing to work with Ambrook because we actually are solving their problem.
When you think about those first customers, what was it like sort of getting a yes? I imagine there was some skepticism you encountered originally.
Yeah, totally.
There certainly is an incentive to be cost conscious.
Yeah.
What were those first conversations like?
So just give you a sense of how hard it is, I think, to get initial
I want to know exactly
conversations.
How hard it is.
It took us, I think, 3 years to convince 30 farms to switch over to Ambrook. And then it took
10 farms a year.
I know. And then it took us another 2 years to get to where we are today, which is over 7,000 customers on the platform. And it was also because the product was the product is in a much more developed place now, but you have to start somewhere, right? And so to convince our first customers to switch off of something like QuickBooks or to move on to us for their financial operating system, really, we did all sorts of stuff. We found one of our customers was the brother of someone that I had talked to, another one was I ran some very early Facebook ads. This was before QuickBooks was made for cowboys, but that were basically just do you hate QuickBooks and are you a farm? And we had someone call up.
It's straight to the point.
And we had someone call up and they're like, I do hate QuickBooks and I am a farm. And they're they've been one of our instrumental customers since the beginning. So I think it was it wasn't glamorous. We did one of them was we were a small team and I kind of made this half joke, half promise to the team. I was like, if you get us a customer in Hawaii, we will do our next retreat in Hawaii.
Did it happen?
Oh yeah. So it's very 2 people on our team just crushed through cold calls until we got a farm in Hawaii. So we all went to Maui to go and onboard that customer.
You all went to Maui to go see that customer. What kind of farm is it?
It's this really cool, actually. The customer is Hana Ranch. It's at the end of the road to Hana, if you've ever been in Maui.
Yeah.
And so they do all sorts of really interesting things. They do some cattle, some horses.
Thinking about those 3 years where you were picking up 10 customers a year, What were those conversations like? What were the questions they were asking you? What did it take to persuade them? And was it the same every time in some ways, or was it completely different for every person?
It got more and more similar near the end of that 30 than at the beginning. And I think that can kind of symbolize like that's what finding product market fit kind of looks like.
By the end of the 30, you kind of know how the conversation's
Exactly.
going to
So
go.
end
But
of the
by
30,
conversation 2,
totally.
you're in.
Not
You're
enough
in
data points.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think convincing them, I mean, our first, I think 15 or so customers we onboarded by hand, as in we like in person. We would usually fly, take a connecting flight to a regional airport and then drive 2 hours to where the farm was. And we would sit down with them by their computer and we would move them over onto the software manually. And that was so important in terms of learning. And then it was like a big deal when we moved to video onboarding. But
What customer number did you move to video
I think
onboarding?
It was like 15 or 20, something like that. Yeah. And
so for 2 years, give or
for
take.
2 years, yeah, we were onboarding people like in person. You learn a lot from doing that. But the types of questions are all sorts of questions. It was like anywhere from if folks hadn't moved to cloud-based software before, there's a lot of security questions like related to that folks are still considering, right? I think we don't think about that initially in tech as much, but there's that to, can it handle X, Y, or Z edge case, which in the beginning, those edge cases were actually more main cases that we couldn't handle, right? Until we like built that in. And so there were a lot of things that the speed and the pickup is not just the team's ability to learn how to objection handle or to do those types of things, but it is also like the product itself getting better from the realization that, we're missing this huge chunk of a workflow that we have to go and build.
How do you think about customer acquisition costs? Because it sounds like it, especially at the beginning, it took a lot to acquire a customer, not just in terms of money, but in terms of time. Mm-hmm. How do you think about scaling down those costs?
Yeah, totally. You want to basically find channels that get less expensive over time, not more expensive over time. The pretty normal cost curve for any SaaS product, but you do the things that are non-scalable, and then you basically realize that actually in the states in which we have more than 1% market share today for farms, our CAC is half of the states where we have, let's say, 10 to 25 bips of market penetration, and the delta there is social proof. Right? The delta there is word of mouth, and so we actually are seeing costs get down over time as more and more folks know other people who are on Ambrook, and the social proof can kind of sell itself.
At a certain point, it's a network effect.
Yeah, exactly.
When you think about the state of farming in America, what does this audience need to know?
I think farmers are more resilient and more fragile than people maybe appreciate day to day. I think over the past 30 years, you've essentially seen a hardening of the supply demand, or like the inputs outputs, basically, that most commodity agriculture, then there are some farms that are diversifying, which is a strategy that increasingly folks are employing. Diversification is good business. Diversification also brings more complicated bookkeeping, which is where Ambrook helps. But let's say the vast majority of agriculture in the U.S. is still commodity agriculture. You have like wars will affect that now, right? Because the price of fertilizer basically is like very much tied to what's happening in the Middle East, and so there's a sort of hardening of that, and I think in that way there's a fragility to it. There is a year over year, like margins are getting thinner and thinner for a lot of these producers, which forces sort of a diversification effort. But there's also a resilience, which is that this has always been the case in agriculture. Like commodity markets go through cycles, and you have to essentially like plan in the good times for the bad times. And that is just a known, I think with talking with a lot of our customers, it's just so much respect for our customers. But there is this almost like deep acceptance of the external factors that could just like the weather, that could just wipe, a whole season's worth of effort if it rains at the wrong time of the year.
Is it a serenity prayer thing at a certain point? Accepting what you cannot change?
Yeah, exactly. Accepting what you cannot change. And I think
have the courage to change the things I can, the wisdom to know the difference.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that there's just like a deep resilience in that. And I think that I think the mission of Ambrook is how do you help tease that out so that that resilience time frame can look longer and longer, rather than just thinking through these very short term cycles, which
buying them time.
Yeah, buying them time. And I think that like most it's not just farms, like most Americans today are living paycheck to paycheck, right? And I think you can extend that when we're on these different risk timelines, like, of course, like, folks aren't going to be thinking about like multi-generational things like climate change or something like that. I've just always been interested in like the rooting in sort of the realities of where most Americans are today and kind of solving problems from that lens.
We're at war in Iran. It seems like, from what I've been reading, it's created kind of a perfect storm for farmers. Commodity prices around corn, soybeans were already coming down. There was debt pressure already for a lot of independent farmers. And the war in Iran has affected farmers. Can you talk about what you're hearing from your customers?
It's a little bit of like, if it's not one thing, it's another. And in ag, you have different things that go up and down. So like when like, you know, crop prices might not be favorable, like cattle prices are sky high. And so like our cattle ranchers are doing great, you know, like in terms of some of the prices that they're seeing in the markets right now. Obviously that affects everything. But I think that the bigger thing, your point is that these types of shocks to the system, if they don't always move together at the same time. And so, you know, fertilizer prices spiking does not correlate at the same time as like crop prices going up. And so you see the squeeze. And I think that's really what people are worried about, is like the timing basically of these shocks and these squeezes in a way that maybe if you didn't see the war coming, right, then you might not have hedged correctly. And I think those are the types of things that do worry folks.
How bad is the squeeze right now?
It's not as bad as it probably will get, but it's not certainly not great.
How bad do you think it could get?
The reality is things have gotten slightly worse every year for U.S. agriculture for a long time. I think that's maybe what I'm talking about with the resilience or the resignation, maybe, which is like something has to change.
It has always been hard, so of course it will continue to be hard.
And so there's this resignation. I think that it's a little bit of like frog boiling in a pot of water sort of thing. And so like, yes, it's bad. Yes, it will get worse. The thing about like agriculture, which is different, I would think, than like other industries along the supply chain, is that the government is incentivized to give everyone a floor in the form of subsidies or other types of like support, which you did see sort of like that with the trade war in China, right? You saw a lot of payments out to a lot of different types of U.S. farms. You do see some of it, but it doesn't cover like everything basically. So yeah.
Bearing in mind that farms, it sounds like, have always been tough businesses, and the macro climate and the geopolitical climate has only made it tougher. What is it going to take for the tide to turn, if that is possible?
I think in order for tide to turn in U.S. agriculture more broadly, you're already seeing this with the folks who have been able to figure out something different, but it does look different. It is not the same as like the last 50 years of commodity agriculture. And I think you're already seeing that with a lot of the new farmers and ranchers on the platform for Ambrook. They tend to be a little bit younger, and they tend to actually have structures and ways of doing things that are a little bit different. So maybe it's actually like 3 friends that go in on a plot of land because land is quite expensive, or there's just like, folks are growing even commodity crops, but they also have this like these side businesses basically that they're hustling.
The Airbnb.
The Airbnb. Yeah. It's like, I think there's a sense of like farmers have in sort of the history of America, farmers were always our first entrepreneurs. And so that will continue to be the case. And so I think that people will figure it out. People are really good at figuring it out. But the goal is to essentially like, how do you give people the tools in order to do that? Farmers and ranchers and other business owners in the real economy were also the original 996ers. So
wait, no, say more about that. Actually, like, what do you think people miss about the role of farmers as entrepreneurs, not just today, but in American history? No, please.
Yeah, I mean, not to wade into that discussion, but like,
do it.
I think that it is both brutally hard and still a choice that people make every day to show up and build these types of businesses. And they are not glamorous. They do not get a lot of press. They do not, but they're doing it because for like the love of the game as much as anything, and like stewarding a family legacy. That is the most worthwhile thing, that if I can play a small part in helping folks live the lives, the types of lives that they want to live, and live the type of American dream that they want to live, then I will be very happy.
I'm going to
end with a theory I have. I think we don't think about farms enough on a cultural basis. Like, if you look at history, they actually were sort of central businesses. They were a key component of how society and civilization was organized from the very beginning. And at this point, we've moved far away from it. What do you think it would look like for Americans to be thinking about farms more?
So I think there's two parts of what it would look like. I think the first is what are the conditions that would create that? And then the second is like, what would society be like? I think there's actually a lot that we can do to integrate an awareness of supply chain, as well as what does it look like to grow food in an urban environment, which is where a lot of people live. Like, I think if you ask this question to anyone who lived in a rural community, they'd be like, what are you talking about? I like think about farms all the time, you know, like I'm like surrounded.
Yeah, I should specify it's for this question is directed at a lot of the people I talk to and who frankly listen to this podcast right
totally.
now.
And so so I think that it is about an integration in the everyday like urban environment in a way that we could just be radically different in the way that we actually like integrate food and agriculture in urban spaces. The next time you're at like a farmer's market, ask some questions of the person behind like the counter a bit, because they're most likely, if not the farmer themselves, they're a family member, right? Or they like work on the farm. And I think that's a really great way to be curious. Obviously, like be aware of their time because they're very busy. The piece is what would society look like if we were able to do that? There's a little bit of a romanticism that comes with farming and a way of life in that way that is not true. But there is a part of the romanticism that is true. And I think that there is something around like an understanding and connection back to like farming actually is sometimes actually put in contrast with like conservation or natural spaces. But actually the reality is today, most farms or ranches are the last rewilding zones that we have that are interplayed with human activity. Yes, there's also lots of public lands, and I'm not talking about that as much, but if the decision is between keeping a farm as a farm or selling it to a developer, you should want to keep the farm as a farm. I think there's a lot of things like that I think would probably be a bit more empathetic to sort of what's happening in rural communities today.
The American family farm is the backbone of agriculture. But at the same time, we're losing a lot of these family farms. A lot of them are the ones in the crossfire when the bankruptcies come. What do we lose when we lose these family farms?
I thought a lot about this question. A lot of these farms are they don't just affect themselves, right? They actually are nodes or part of broader communities. And I think really what we're touching on is the decimation of rural economies around the world, but also in America. And thinking about that question you said, which is, you know, what would it look like if more people were aware of the food supply chain or where their food came from? I think it was also awareness of like rural economies impact urban economies. We just don't always see it day to day. It's a system level problem, but rural flight also, it creates these like ripple effects, basically. And so that's sort of one piece. I think and the other piece is really a sense of, I don't want to be too nostalgic about like a way of life or some of these, but I do think that what we talked about, which is like there is a truth to the importance of a romanticism in American society that sometimes easy to forget when we spend all of our time behind a computer screen.
Mackenzie, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Allie.
And that was Mackenzie. In the aftermath of this interview, I keep thinking about how farmers are the original entrepreneurs. We talk about entrepreneurs a lot on this podcast, and we sometimes talk about entrepreneurs in esoteric industries. But farming actually isn't esoteric. Farming is something that affects every single one of us. And when I think about commodity prices, when I think about the war in Iran and the ways in which this is creating challenges for farmers, I think it is worth it to us to understand this industry better, not just as people who are interested in entrepreneurship, but as members of a society. To Mackenzie's point, I think when we think about nostalgia and the role that the American farm sort of plays in our cultural imagination, when we think about losing those family farms, we don't just lose that nostalgia. We lose something very essential about who we are as humans.